right, we are recording.
Okay.
So, I've lost track. I think this is our fourth reading, my fourth section.
Sounds right.
And here we are on page 245.
Yes,
I believe.
we began chapter 5
Right.
today
And
for
now-
this week's reading.
And now we're right up to the end of this section that I thought was called Love, but now I can't remember.
The section we just finished, you mean?
Yeah,
It was called Whims of Mercurius. Yeah.
Right. Which is
Interesting.
Which kind of cracks me up. I know we'll get back to the beginning, but I have to say, like, when I lived in Austin, one of my sort of favorite pastimes at lunch was to read through the local sort of Alterna paper, that all of those like college towns have, and those missed connections were kind of liberally peppered with these kind of like, I'm dating myself for sure, but those 1-900 sex lines.
Yeah.
And they were all about being bi-curious.
Yes.
Right? Which I guess is sort of like what you get for being in a blue city in a red state, right?
Yeah.
But now whenever I hear the word mercurious, I'm always like, what is that you're wondering about?
Well, so much built into the symbology of the thermometer and
Right,
the temperatures,
right.
and I
And
think
it's-
we even ended the last word
Right.
of today's
Very
reading
close to
was
yeah,
100.4.
Right.
And
Right.
his temperature now seems to be at the whim of Claudia, as
Right.
do the
Right.
many other parts of Hans.
Yeah,
is at
right.
her disposal now,
Yeah.
and it turns out that it's been a while since I read this section, but one of the things I noticed was, Thomas Mann jumps in and he says, okay, I recognize, dear reader, that we just spent almost 200 pages on 3 weeks. Now I'm just going to skip the next 3 weeks real fast, and let's
Right.
just say he was in bed.
Right.
And then it
Yeah.
turns out that Hans was disappointed that his temperature didn't go up any higher.
Yeah.
Like he wants to be more of a player at the table with the others.
Well, he's had this kind of fundamental shift.
Yeah, and he wants to be even more part of
Yeah,
it.
that somehow like down there is now like gross, I think is the word.
It's gross. It's like
it's materialistic. Yeah, I mean, what's the? I made a note and now I've lost.
when he's talking to
track of it.
Settembrini, is when he calls it gross.
Yeah, well, Settembrini says the thing. This is around 207, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that's the pages I have marked
Yeah,
there too.
it's 206. He talks about Hans's people as being phlegmatic and energetic,
Right.
right? Which Hans then translates to cruel and ruthless.
Yeah.
And he's talking about, I think, what we would call this kind of bourgeois sensibility. This idea of like putting on fine dinners so that somebody will marry your daughters
Right.
and take them off your hands.
Right.
And so he's had this kind of fundamental change that I think we've kind of flirted with this idea of the Magic Mountain as kind of like Age of Aquarius, Summer of Love, kind of hippie, I forget the whole, what was the Timothy Leary wake up, some drop out,
Tune in,
drop out, or
Yeah,
whatever it
tune
was.
out, turn on,
Yeah,
something.
yeah. But it sort of feels like, in a way, that's what's happened to him. But as is, I think, maybe the case for a lot of, hippie boys in their late teens, early 20s, there's a girl.
There's
Right.
a girl, and it matches. I don't really know what was going on in Germany in the early 20s, other than it recovering from the aftermath of World War I. But the United States has a reputation for the 20s being sort of like heady in the same way that the 60s were. The flapper days and whatnot. And it wouldn't surprise me if Mann, has some of that kind of stuff on his mind if those things are going on in Germany at the time. We spoke on the phone, about a week ago. I remember giving you a call and saying, I think that what might be coming is what maybe makes Mann controversial to the Third Reich and, gets his books burned and stuff like that later, is this kind of like disgust with politics and power and nationalism. And that, what we're going to find out is this becomes a utopian novel in
Yeah.
a way, and a way to like critique the rough, gross ways of men and women down there.
Yeah.
And I feel like this chapter kind of bore out that at
Yeah.
least that's got to be part of the way people are reading this book. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the next 100
Right.
pages, but
Right, and I think there's certainly I would argue that it is sort of leaning the way that you were suggesting. There's still some room, I think, for it to, maybe be less concerned with sort of politics or economy and more with what I might call culture, or some kind of vaguely philosophical set of values. I found myself kind of thinking, especially because of the mercurial thing, I found myself thinking a lot about Gravity's Rainbow, especially at the very end of this passage, or the very end of this reading, the section maybe with the X-rays forward. In the
yeah, that X-ray scene we probably need to talk about.
I
But
definitely want to circle back to that, but just generally speaking, I found myself thinking that this chapter did this section did a really interesting job of blending kind of this kind of breaking technology, and there's obviously excitement about the X-ray machine and all that, but also kind of blending it with the sort of mysticism. Like I don't know how familiar you are with Gravity's Rainbow, but there's that it's the German V2 rockets that are ballistic, right? So they do that parabolic arc and they land where they land.
Yes.
Right. And then there's this kind of mystical connection we have with the protagonist of that novel.
Yes.
That allows scientists to sort of predict where these rockets are going to land.
I've not read Gravity's Rainbow. But I'm following what you're saying.
I'm trying to avoid some titillating spoilers. In my description of it, but it had a sort of I don't know if the similarity really bears out. I should also point out, while I was traveling last week, I watched the latest Matrix movie on the plane, and I felt that there were moments in this where there was definitely a sort of Morpheus style, like, oh, you think you know what real is, and I might want to circle back to that at some point, but I think that the ending in today's reading, to me, sort of felt a bit of that kind of like magical realism that I want to call second wave, that kind of post. The big South American, sort of originators, and these kind of like 1960s versions that are kind of they have that kind of, I don't know, new wave sensibility, if I can kind of blend genres there, and I really think this you really kind of zeroed in on it when you were saying that the way that the temperature seems to be connected. What it's measuring is not this illness; it's measuring this relationship to Claudia. That there's all this other stuff happening, and I think one of the things that we're supposed to do is sort of think about, these scientific truths and how sort of readily they are something magical. In that sense.
Yeah, I thought about. I know I've brought up like sort of musical references before, but the whole relationship between Claudia and his temperature, I couldn't help but go to YouTube and crank Hot Blooded by 401 Good Time.
Right.
I've got a fever of 103. Of course, if his ever went up to 103, he'd be like really happy.
Yeah.
He'd be like, yes, but she does, like, when he interacts with her, his temperature goes up, and I think there's some magical realist elements to that.
Well, I mean, I think it's also just literally true, right? I mean, there are these measurable physical phenomena.
When your heart rate goes up when you're excited and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I remember reading a long time ago. I don't actually remember if this was measured in some kind of double-blind study or if it was a theory, but the idea was that when you were around somebody you liked, your eyes dilated.
Right.
And this is part of why people you like are pretty, right? Because your vision kind of...
Your vision is distorted or changes.
I remember at the time thinking, oh, it's like God's beer goggles,
Right.
Like I like that person, and it just so happens that they get all like fuzzy and soft focus.
Nice.
And I like that. But yeah, so there's that. But then I think there's also this kind of cool play that I think of as really high literary, kind of like really, and I think we're circling back to maybe our first week's discussion, this very kind of modernist thing. And I'll tell you where that really jumped out to me. Really, I think of this reading as largely the Settembrini show. I mean, he really does a lot of
mouth running.
Yeah, which is kind of what he's there for.
Yeah.
But on 203, right, he's come in, he makes this visit, this very, I think, I was going to say Jungian sort of appearance at Hans's sickbed.
Well, yeah, doesn't he just like sort of, he's there, and the doctor is, one of the doctors comes in through the balcony. Yeah, so that's like almost like a vampire.
I was going to say very Dracula.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But no, the Italian comes in through the front door, but he does a sort of Kramer entrance,
Yes.
and lights on,
Yeah.
and we find out later he catches Hans in the middle of daydreaming about Claudia, and he's like caught, but like that American Pie scene.
Yes.
But he comes in, and I think this is supposed to be a really important moment. And it's not Jungian as much as I think is it's sort of Campbellian, right? It's this kind of hero's journey, and this is that kind of figure who is helping the hero navigate the underworld, trying to navigate back and to fix it.
Yeah.
And he tells the story about the German Russian woman on 203.
Right.
And he says she came from the Baltic provinces somewhere, lymphatic, anemic, but probably some more serious trouble as well. She spent a month here and complained that she felt ill all the time. They told her to be patient, and I want to pause there for a second. They told her to be patient. Is just a fabulous sentence.
Absolutely.
Tucked in there.
Absolutely.
Right? There's so much going on in this little, what is that, 6 words?
Yeah.
Because they're telling her to be a better patient.
Yeah.
To be a patient.
Right.
Right. That what's a patient do? He waits around.
Yes.
This is what it means to be a patient at the hospital, and this is what Hans and his cousin and Settembrini and all of these people seem to just excel at.
Yeah.
Right. Till they be patient, and then there's this. I think even more interesting. Like they kind of set you up with this, right? They kind of get you thinking in this, fundamentally kind of layered way, or Man get you thinking about this. And this, I want to like chef kiss to the translator on this one. Is that had to be a really good piece of work there. Another month passes. She continues to assert that she's actually worse instead of better. They point out to her, and this is where I start thinking about the Matrix. They point out to her that only the physician can judge how she is. She herself only knows how she feels, which does not signify.
Right.
And so there's this kind of pseudoscience, right, that basically says, like, these doctors with their devices, with their thermometers and their x-rays, they can tell you what you are.
Right.
In this, like, material, factual, scientific 20th century way.
Yeah.
All you can do is report on this like subjective, mystical, 18th century way.
Yeah.
What you feel.
Yeah.
And
which really hasn't changed that much in the fullness of time. Like people still will be like, my leg hurts, and they don't know if it's broken or if it's torn ligament or any more than the 14th century people did.
Well, I don't know if you've ever noticed, I've got a scar here from a pretty bad cut I got as a kid that actually required 20 stitches. Mm-hmm. And 10 on the inside, 10 on the outside. And they gave me 2 shots, I think, of Novocaine at the emergency room. And the doctor was sort of stitching it up, and it wore off. I'm here to tell you. The Novocaine wore off before he was done. And I was like, they had me like kind of clamped in because it's so close to my mouth. I couldn't say anything without moving my jaw, and I was like terrified that if I tried to speak, that I was going to like end up with a needle in my eye. Or something.
Right.
And so I was like literally trying to like tap out,
Yeah.
And the doctor kept saying, no, this can't hurt. And I was just kind of like, who the hell are you?
Yeah.
I'm like, you get to tell me about the X-ray.
Right.
I get to tell you how I feel.
Yes.
Like let's remember who's expert on what.
Yes.
And this is, and I feel like what Settembrini is doing here is kind of like, he's seen that Hans has crossed the threshold, and now he's imparting this like essential knowledge about how this thing works.
Yeah.
What the physics in this matrix. This is that Morpheus speech about some rules can be bent,
Yeah.
some can be broken,
Right.
And
they all are cluing him in more now that he's one of them.
right.
It's not just Settembrini, it's also the two doctors,
Yeah.
and even Madame Stahl and the others at table.
Yeah.
They're all sort of like treating him differently now. You could even argue that Claudia's treating him differently now. I mean, they do have, extended eye contact, and they have their first conversation in today's reading. He passes her on the hill when they're going for the walk, and they say
Right.
hello.
Yeah, and they have a little French conversation.
And they ran
together.
into each other in the waiting room too,
Right,
waiting
right,
for
right.
the X-ray. Of course, that was Joaquin that talked to
Yeah.
her there, but Hans was very dialed in on what was being
Well,
said.
and I love Hans, and this is kind of an aside, but I love that Hans rationalizes this exchange so fundamentally.
Right.
For a guy who's afraid of analysis.
Yeah.
I mean, he just analyzes this moment to within an inch of its life.
Yeah.
And he says, "Oh, I can tell that she knows what's up with us because she knew to talk to my cousin."
Right.
Because she knew that if it were us, then the sparks would fly.
Right,
She's
right.
doing it in self-defense.
Right.
She didn't want to have to get naked right there.
And I love how the reader is left wondering, does she know?
Right.
Or is this all in Hans's head? Like, I don't know that that's been cleared up. I mean, it's like, I guess we're supposed to believe she really is making eyes at him and smirking sometimes and noticing him. But this could all be in his head. I mean, we just don't know yet.
I think it seems like too much of a stretch to imagine that she's not looking his way.
She's got to know he's checking her out.
But it does seem like there's a lot of wiggle room in terms of his interpretation of this.
Yeah.
And we're back to this like knowing versus feeling, you know, sort of thing. And it reminds me of this one other thing that Settembrini said, and then I'll stop flogging that. And now I can't quite remember where it was, but he says something about analysis. It's in that section where he's talking about the German Russian, but I think it's a little bit later.
Yeah, that conversation
Yeah.
does go on for a while.
Yeah. But there's something about how analysis is an instrument, and I'm blanking on the important part, but I remember that it was important. I'll come back to it if I can see where it is, but it does kind of.
I mean, Settembrini also, while you're looking for that, he points out too that there is some danger in getting too caught up on the mountain. He talks about this man at the bottom of 206. I found this to be an interesting little story. He says, I could tell you of a young man I know, a husband and son, who was up here for 11 months, at the bottom of 206. He was a little older than you, yes, rather older. They let him go home provisionally, as much improved. He returned to the bosom of his family, not uncles, you understand, but his wife and his mother. The whole day he lay with the thermometer in his mouth. He took no interest in anything else. You don't understand, he said. No one understands who has not lived up there. Down here, the fundamental conception is lacking. In the end, it was the mother who settled it. Go back, she said. There is nothing to be done with you anymore. So I think Settembrini is trying to maintain some sort of balance between understanding that things are different here, but don't completely give yourself to it either. Sometimes I'm having a hard time figuring out, how much of what Settembrini is doing is just solipsizing and how much of it is like a coherent set of advice strategies for Hans. But that seemed to be a warning that, okay, now that you get it, be careful not to get too deep into it,
Yeah. I mean, there's this sort of familiar echo of,
including the fixation with death, which he says is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's this kind of familiar echo of forgetfulness that you see in a lot of sort of stories and myth. Was it the sirens in the Odyssey?
Yeah, yeah.
Who made people forget
Yes,
themselves?
yes.
Or
the Lotus Eaters.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, that also comes, I think, from either the Odyssey or originally from the Odyssey
Yeah.
or the Aeneid. I can't remember.
Right, and then there's like the Tennyson poem or something.
Right. That is
He's
harkening-
riffing off of
harkening
it.
back to that.
Yeah.
These people who or even the poppy fields in Yellow Brick Road.
Right.
In Wizard of Oz.
Right.
So so in a way, my opinion of Settembrini hasn't changed much, right? He's kind of a blowhard. He kind of talks a lot, and what I kind of want to say is, like, when you talk that much, you can't help but be right a little bit.
Right.
But that doesn't make you smart.
Right, right.
It's like the shotgun.
Yeah, it's going to hit something.
Something's going to stick.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he does seem to have it. If he's not right exactly, and I'm not sure he's not, but if he's not right, he does seem to have this kind of more and more coherent thing. It's also sort of complicated.
Yeah.
Right. In the sense, and I still don't love him. But,
Right.
But I think as Hans shifts towards being a sort of native of the mountain, like suddenly Settembrini's making more sense,
Yeah.
or something like that.
And it may be that we're just being conditioned into it as we ourselves become more native to the
right?
mountain.
Yeah. There's something there. But then aside from him, there's not a whole lot, I think, that actually happens in this reading.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on with Claudia. There was some interesting stuff about her with children I wanted to bring up, and I wonder what sort of is going on there. Like at the bottom of 215, he pressed her to find because there's suggestion that Claudia has had a man coming to visit her.
Right.
And so Hans
The
gets
school-
upset about that.
The school teacher
Yeah.
who Hans flirts with.
Yeah, and he's like, he wants to know at the bottom of 215 if she
Yeah.
had children. Oh, no, she had none. What should a
Right.
woman like her do
Right.
with children? Probably she was strictly forbidden to have any.
Yeah.
And if she did, what kind of children would they be? Hans Kostorp was forced to acquiesce, and now it was probably late in the day he threw out with prodigious objectivity. And then comes the revelation at the bottom. How old is she? 30, at worst no more than 28. The suggestion is she might be a little older than Hans.
Right.
And then at the end of that paragraph, to punish him, she went on to say that she knew Frau Schalku entertained a male visitor, a certain fellow countryman who lived down in the Platz. She received him afternoons in her chamber. It was a good shot.
Right. Well,
I didn't really know what to think about all that,
yeah. Well, I mean,
She's a modern woman. She's got lovers, I
right,
guess.
Right. Or she's just this like person with her own life outside of this fantasy that Hans has built around her.
And the doctor paints her, and they're
Right.
alone together, and
Well-
Hans is intimidated by that, and he's like, I wonder if he paints just the top half of her or the whole thing, And
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing that I'm blanking on the schoolmistress's name, but the one that Hans gossips with, that gossiping began as a kind of flirtation.
Yeah.
At least a playful something.
A playful banter.
And I wonder if part of what we're seeing here is, and this is the other thing I wrote down that I wanted to talk about today, but the sense that he's gone too far, that he's got to play this game properly, and part of that means keeping the schoolmistress kind of, if not front and center, like on the stage.
Yeah.
And-
Like, let's not
and-
make it all about Claudia.
Right, and
Yeah.
so he does sort of go too far, and so she kind of like jerks his leash a
Yeah.
little bit with this revelation. This is in that chapter, right? The sudden illumination or sudden revelation, or something
Yeah.
like that. Sudden enlightenment,
Right.
That I think is about more than just that, but that is
Yeah.
among the stuff. And plus later we find out about the painting in that sense. But one of the suggestions that I think the book has, and I will freely acknowledge that this is a thing I think about, especially when I think about younger me. And so I might be projecting a little bit, something that's not here as fully formed as I think, but I think there's something here. As this sort of young man in love, as this young man who seems to have just in the reading now given himself over to this. I don't think he was really
He's admitted
sure.
to himself he's in love with it.
I don't think he was really sure
Yeah.
prior to his diagnosis.
Right.
What was really going on, and now he's decided. This is love, and the narrator is kind of interestingly kind of like non-committal.
Right.
Well, if it's love, let's just call it.
Let's
love.
call love
You
because we don't have a better word for it.
Up here.
Yeah.
Right. But young Hans Castorp in love is a person who uses people.
Yeah.
And they're not terribly necessarily, but I know I'm jumping around a lot today, and partly is I think I'm still jet lagged a bit or something, but right towards the end at 2:42, 2:43, I think we see this kind of moment, right? He's had that interaction with Claudia.
Oh, right, and he uses the half-lunger.
Well, and he uses Joachim first.
Yeah.
And then he's not enough, so he's got to draw this other woman in Kleefeld.
Yeah, right.
Kleefeld, I think.
Kleefeld?
Who the one who whistles through her pneumothorax, and he is having this kind of loud, like self-consciously loud, attention-seeking conversation with her, trying to draw Claudia's attention, and Kleefeld.
Well, she's aware.
She knows
she was being made a fool of and felt piqued accordingly.
On 243, it says, let's see.
And Claudia treats him with scorn for doing it.
I think so, yeah.
It says, for a moment, Plibeslav eyes glided rapidly down his figure as he sat there one knee over the other with a deliberate insouciance in which had all the effect of scorn. They paused for a space on his yellow boots, and then carelessly, with perhaps a smile in their depths, withdrew. And so to me, that was Claudia being like, that was beneath you, dude.
Right.
What you just did to Kleefeld. I agree. And it's also true that I'm reminded of young me as well. I think a lot of young men, and maybe young women too for that matter, in part of the theatric of being in love, tend too often to view everybody else in the world as sort of pawns to be moved around as part of this courtship, that this is one of the dangers of it, maybe.
Yeah, well, here, the section I was thinking of is just prior to that bit you read, it's on 242. Joachim, quite aware of the role that he was being forced upon him, sat with his eyes on the ground. Even Fraulein Kleefeld gradually perceived from Hans Castorp's distraught and wondering eye that she was being made a tool of, and felt piqued accordingly.
Right.
And I think that is a really, I mean, I don't know that this is necessarily super important. I think maybe what's happening here is like some stuff that was already on my mind.
Yeah.
Just happened to bump into this at the same time.
Yeah.
And I just think it's a really interesting thing that, because we've been having all these conversations about, Castorp as this sort of young, naive, inexperienced virgin, perhaps gay, trying to sort of figure things out. And all of this language, without necessarily coming right out and saying it, is pretty sympathetic. It's pretty, kind of springtime romance kind of language. But I'm remembering I took a Shakespeare seminar forever ago, and there's that old cliche that everybody repeats from Nietzsche about comedy ends with a marriage and tragedy with a funeral.
Yeah.
And the professor was talking about this kind of thing, and really not disagreeing, but also trying to kind of shade and sort of remind us that there's this nuance and that kind of thing. And one of the things that really came up, I think this was 12th Night we were working on, but I can't remember exactly. But one of the things that at least his theory was that that Shakespeare was sort of deeply concerned with the sort of public function of the marriage as this reminder to the young couple that the world outside them existed, and they couldn't just like that there was this very dangerous impulse to just kind of like collapse in on each other,
Yeah.
and shut out the rest of the world.
Right.
And you know,
That's
I think,
interesting.
I think part of what's going on in this little tiny scene here is I'm not ready to say that Hans is a bad guy here, but he's doing a bad thing.
He is.
In,
It's more compelling when somebody who's not bad does a bad thing in literature anyway. And,
Maybe so.
You know, often
Yeah.
literary critics will talk about that. They'll be like, you know, of course Palpatine is going to do evil shit in Star Wars. It's
Right.
much more scary if Luke looks like he's about to do something
Right.
bad, you know,
Right.
and more compelling.
Right.
That
Well,
is to say.
we often need our heroes to have made that one bad decision
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
past.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
so that they can be like properly haunted
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
their own human frailty. But you know, I will say, I hope, for a lot of people's sake, my own included, that these are forgivable sins.
Me too.
But
Especially since we have so much more further to go in the book.
But it's interesting to me that you know, and I don't know, maybe this is kind of dumb in a way, but you know, here's Thomas Mann really, you know, beginning to kind of like, you know, finally, I think heat this thing up a little.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I won't lie, I was not very thrilled for
Yeah.
a couple hundred pages.
Same.
I was like, man, where is this going?
Yeah, why did we pick this one?
You know, but I feel like we're finally like, you know, we're finally getting a little smoke.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
a little.
yeah.
It's warming up to something, and in the midst of all this kind of interesting philosophizing, and in the midst of this kind of like literariness, there's also this really like just mundane, but fundamentally for me just like gut-wrenching reality about just being a young man.
Yeah.
Or I suppose
Yeah.
a young person, but
And the setting, I guess, is operating on a symbolic level there. Like, when you're a young man, you kind of occupy your own world.
yeah,
And everybody around you is, like, symbolical in some ways. That the lesson you were talking about with Shakespeare, it's kind of hard for that to sink in on you when you're a young man. You know, that the rest of the world exists and would exist even if you ceased existing, you know.
well, not only that, and this is maybe where I kind of chafe most at Settembrini, is I think, and I'm maybe verging into TMI here, but I think that like the reason that we see this kind of behavior from young men, and you can almost sort of measure the extent of this behavior, I think, based on the like the sincerity of that young man's belief that this is a novel thing he has experienced.
Right.
That like yeah, there are rules, but this is so different and so new.
'Cause it's
no
me.
no one has ever felt what I'm feeling.
Right.
And because of that, everything's out the window. And I'm not. This is not that like, you know, erect penis has no conscience argument.
Right.
It is a more, I think, culturally based kind of selfishness that might just be about youth. I don't know.
Well, I mean, look at the way in which people continue to talk about Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah.
And, you know, it bothers a lot of people that Catcher in the Rye remains highly regarded because Holden's obviously full of shit. And, you know, they make a lot of connections between what Salinger did there and toxic masculinity. But I guess in defense of Salinger, you know, I feel like he's talking about in that book what you're saying, you know, that like Holden or not, what he's going through is what a lot of young men go through. And Salinger freaking chronicled it, you
Yeah.
know. And by the way, it remains popular because people read it and see themselves in it. And you know, it doesn't have to mean we're celebrating it. It's just like more of a mirror up to that cultural force you're talking about. And I definitely see some of that going on with Hans. I don't know what to make, and I know we're running out of time soon, but I don't know what to make of Joaquin's dynamic with Marusa. I'm like, that's all being filtered through Hans, and so I'm trying to be careful as a reader to believe that Joaquin has the same feelings for Marusha. I don't know how to pronounce her name,
Yeah.
but that Hans has for Claudia or not. But I guess we're supposed to believe Hans that every time the girl with the ruby ring comes by, Joaquin drops his head, and he is,
Right.
you know, maybe he's got feelings for her. I would like to see Mon
Right.
stop being so vague about that and like give me something, you know.
Yeah, it's
to
an
hang on with
interesting.
there.
It's an interesting. Yeah, and part of what's going on here, again, not to just always bring it back to my point, but you know, is we have a hard time. A lot of this just gets eclipsed by Hans's sense of like the, you know, the grandness of this thing that he alone has discovered.
Right,
You know,
right.
and that's part of it. The other thing that I think we should kind of swing back to is this scene with the X-ray machine.
Yeah.
And as a kind of segue to that, I'll say I just discovered where I
Okay.
just misnumbered the section where Settembrini talks about analysis. It's 231.
Okay.
And he says analysis is an instrument of enlightenment and civilization. Is analysis as an instrument of enlightenment and civilization is good insofar as it shatters absurd convictions, acts as a solvent upon natural prejudices, and undermines authority. Good, in other words, in that it sets free, refines, humanizes, makes slaves ripe for freedom. It's more matrix there, right? But it is bad, very bad, insofar as it stands in the way of action.
Yeah.
And so there's some.
He even says, he goes on, maims life at its roots.
Yeah, and so then there's this kind of like I don't know, Tennyson or Wordsworth even, kind of romanticism that's just or I mean I suppose maybe more like John Donne.
Yeah.
Just like get after it. It's life's short.
Yeah.
Don't
Don't overthink things.
Right, and when I was in the Scouts and we were given like field problems to solve, one of the worst things to be accused of in that culture, and I think this comes from a military background, but I don't really know, is analysis paralysis.
Right.
That like
Right.
that like eventually they're just like, dude, break something, do
Right.
something,
Right.
like,
Set something on fire.
like doing the wrong thing
Yeah.
now is going to be better than doing nothing.
Right,
you know?
right.
And so I think there's this kind of tension, and this is kind of what you were hinting at, or really just spelling out earlier with Settembrini, right? Is that he's like, well, that's bad. So is this.
Yeah.
You really gotta,
Yeah.
get in the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And so but with this analysis as an instrument that can be good or bad, that really felt like the X-ray machine was just sort of waiting to be kind of given this
Yeah.
treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I looked it up, and the X-ray was only invented in 1895.
Right.
So,
So this is really novel.
We've said that the setting of this novel, I think we've placed it as something in the neighborhood of 1910.
Yeah.
Based on various things that happened in the first 200 pages and change. So, the X-ray coming out in 1895 means that this is a very brand spanking new technology. And it is interesting how they use darkness to illuminate light, and they use light to illuminate darkness. I enjoyed
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Those vivid
There's this
descriptions.
poetic something going on there.
Yeah.
But there's this kind of interesting, I mean, obviously Mon wants us to sort of sit up and pay attention to this procedure, this process.
Yeah.
It's really, we get more description of that than we get, which I think is just a couple minutes.
Yeah.
Than we do of the whole 3 weeks of
Right.
Hans's
Convalescence in the
initial,
bed.
yeah. But there's all that stuff, that we already expect. But it also felt very like cinematic Frankenstein, not the novel, but very kind of like Frankenstein, movie Frankenstein. Like on 224, he's watching Joachim get his X-ray.
Yeah.
And he. Where it is, very at the top, Joachim had taken his place on a sort of shoemaker's bench in front of a board, which he embraced. And I think this is kind of interesting, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
they're doing a long X-ray, right? So he's
You got to grab a hold of it.
he's wrapping his arm around, but it's it's in the middle of this chapter that's all about being in love, right? And so here he is, hugging this weird technology. Pressed his breast against it while the assistant improved his position, massaging his back, putting his
Right.
arms further forward, right? I'm reminded of some descriptions I've heard of mammograms, right?
Right.
There's this like uncomfortable, strangely intimate, not at all fun sort of procedure,
Right.
Which brings with it all this trepidation and whatnot. But then skip down a little bit, right? Now for the space of 2 seconds, fearful powers were in play. Streams of thousands, of 100,000 of volts, Hans Castorp seemed to recall, which were necessary to pierce through the solid matter. They could hardly be confined to their office. They tried to escape through other outlets. There were explosions like pistol shots, blue sparks on the measuring apparatus, long lightnings crackled along the walls. I mean,
Some of the best writing in the book so far.
I mean, this is alarming. I mean, can
Yeah.
you imagine if you just you went to the doctor's office and I got this cough, and he's like, well, let me just do this thing, and suddenly the room was electrified.
Right.
This is serious mad scientist
Yeah,
territory.
yeah.
But they're all taking it in stride.
Yeah.
Right? They're all like, oh yeah, this is just how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really know the mechanism. I mean, obviously they're using this power to generate the X-rays that are gonna,
Which is very different than getting X-rayed today. I mean, it was.
I mean, in some ways, it's exactly the same, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I went to the dentist not too long ago, and they did the X-rays they do
Right.
every once in a while.
Yeah.
And I'm always kind of, and I'm not trying to be John Birch about this or anything. Don't get me wrong, but I'm always kind of amused at all of the suggestions that this is safe.
Right.
Followed by the lead apron, and then the assistant goes all the way outside the room.
Right. Yes.
I mean, it'd be like if I were here, open this, but wait a second, let me.
Let me duck out. Yeah.
So I mean, there still is this kind of fundamental power. I mean, we know now much more how dangerous these things are. I mean, Curie got cancer.
Right.
Right. And so. In a way, this is kind of this is sort of reckless. But it's also just work a day.
And like I said too, though, I think this sequence has some of the best writing we get in the whole book. This is the passage I was talking about. It's on this right across on 225 when Baron says, or actually it's Hans who says, first, we must wash our eyes with darkness to see what we want to see.
Yeah.
I love that. And I mean, it sort of justifies what I consider to be a little bit of a slog up the mountain and in the mountain. This really charmed and grabbed my attention. And I thought it was great that all this literal electricity manifested after the figurative electricity of running into Claudia in the waiting room.
Well, and
that was an interesting follow-up, followed by, okay, now I'm going to talk to her.
Right.
And then the temperature goes up. And so I really felt like it was literally kind of a pyrotechnic sequence in the book.
Well, and it swings back to this kind of erotic reading, because he's imagining seeing Claudia's insides,
right?
He's
jealous of the Hofrat for having done this.
There's this intimacy, right? And even Settembrini is I don't need to see my skeleton.
Well, they talk about the gothic nature of this. Hans is reminded that he will die when he sees his skeleton, because he realizes the flesh is all going to fade away. Right. That's all that's going to be left of you.
He calls it a memento mori.
A memento mori. That's right.
Well, and this is a thing I talk about with my students a lot, right? That. And again, I don't know how universal this is, but I think on some fundamental level, we are all vaguely uncomfortable thinking about how squishy we are on the inside.
Yes.
I'm perfectly happy. I mean, 21st century science and all, but I'm also perfectly happy to spend most of my life with this vague sense that I'm just kind of a solid Ken doll in there.
It makes you appreciate in a twisted way these movements where billionaire class people are trying to figure out ways, can I upload myself into a computer and just disregard my body altogether?
Yeah.
Part of it is the will to live forever, but you got to figure maybe the Musks and the Bezoses and stuff like that are just man, I have all this power and I'm still jelly inside. This is some bullshit right here.
Right.
You know, like,
Right.
like I
Yeah.
want to be just like fully disembodied and you know,
Right.
this virtual reality upload is the way to
Right.
do it.
Right.
There is, I think, some or participation in the science fiction genre going on in this book, in as much as, let's face it, the medical science is at the heart of the book, and it's a work of fiction.
Right.
And now we get the X-ray machine, and so it makes me think, you know, that maybe this is a little bit more sci-fi of a book than I had been giving it credit for as we explore this business of the X-ray and the skeleton, and now that we're making these other connections, and remembering that the whole book is like science-y because
Right.
they're
Right.
in a hospital.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
interesting to think
Well,
about too.
And I'm just saying, if this were a seminar,
Yeah.
you know, and partly it would be timing, but also sort of genuine. I would at this point make my decision that I was going to write my seminar paper about the X-ray scene,
Yeah.
and just kind of like hope that something comes up in the next 600 pages,
Yeah.
500 pages
To back up what you
Yeah,
think it means.
that will
Yeah.
like give me a good last page.
Yeah.
But you can tell, as you pointed out, the writing just catches fire here as well. This other sequence, when they're finally looking at it, so the X-ray is being taken, and
Right.
it's all dramatic, and then there's this hush, and it feels biblical to me. It
Yeah.
feels what it really feels like, and it's been a while since I've read this, so like nobody, you know, scream at me about like getting my Bible wrong.
Yeah.
But it feels like Revelations. It feels like
Yeah.
the book of Revelations. On 226, the doctor is showing Joachim's X-ray to Hans.
Right.
And you know, they've both taken X-rays, but I guess they're waiting for Hans's to develop. Or
Yeah,
something,
yeah, yeah.
And they're looking at Joachim's. Hans's attention. This is about two-thirds, maybe a quarter of the way down. Hans's attention was taken up by something like a bag, a strange animal shape, darkly visible behind the middle column, or more on the right side of it. The spectator's right. It expanded and contracted regularly, a little after the fashion of a swimming jellyfish. Look at his heart, said Hofrat. Lifted his huge hand again from his thigh and pointed with his forefinger at the pulsating shadow. Good God, it was his heart. It was Joachim's honor-loving heart that Hans Castorp saw.
Yeah.
I am looking at your heart, he said in a suppressed voice. Go ahead, answered Joachim. I mean, so what I'm reminded here is in the book of Revelations, there's the language of the seals, the 7 seals, right? And there's this repetition where the angel says like, "Come and see," and the line after is always, "And I saw."
Right.
And,
Right.
And it just feels like this. I mean, I can't begin to imagine how alarming, you know, to a 1910 human being. And this is real time.
Yeah.
I mean, like they are watching his heart beat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we take this stuff like sonograms for granted today, but yeah.
But how? I mean, you know, and I'm looking at your heart, he said in a suppressed voice. I mean,
Yeah.
this is church talk, right? He's
Yeah.
whispering,
Yeah.
right? And Joachim has, go ahead.
But it's the Church of Science,
Right,
is what's
right.
interesting.
Yeah. He smiled politely up there in the darkness.
Yeah.
Right.
Probably he smiled politely. I love the word probably there too.
Yeah.
But the Hofrat told him to be quiet and not betray any sensibility. It's almost like the Hofrat is, to extend your analogy, as a scientist, he is a minister also.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like he's presiding over this very religious moment.
Well, am I remembering it right that he's the one who wears all black?
No, he wears all white.
Okay, yeah.
I can't remember the name of the other doctor.
Shoot, I had it and I just lost it. It starts with a K.
Yeah. The other one wears all black. His
Yeah.
assistant wears all black.
Right.
It's been a while since we saw him.
Yeah.
He's the one that enters through the balcony, though.
Yeah, Krakowski.
Krakowski,
something
yes.
like that. Yeah. But yeah, so this X-ray sequence, you know, and then of course, you know, this follows. You know, here we are looking at Joachim's heart.
Yeah.
And then there's this neat little parallelism. This is probably where I would begin my seminar paper.
Yeah.
We end today's reading and the chapter using not science but something more, I don't know, ancient to to look at Hans's heart,
Yeah.
you know, as he's trying so hard to get Claudia's attention,
Right.
You know, and sort of doing this dark thing in the process, using these people around him in the process.
Yeah, you know, the last paragraph of today's reading, it had the greeting he had exchanged with Claudia Chacou had overcome the mortifying depression. So he's depressed because she treated him badly for using Kleefeld. Now she treats him well because he does the proper thing and actually talks to her.
Speaks to her. Yeah.
And it was at bottom.
Yeah.
The consciousness of this, which had lain at the root of Hans Kostorp's gratification. Yes, Joachim was right. Mercurius was mounting again. When Hans Kostorp consulted him on their return from their walk, he had climbed up to 100.4.
Now, is it just me?
I dig it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all in. I think, but is it just me, or is there just like a little smirk? There's like a little humor in that ending, right?
Yeah.
That like a kind of like you know, we all know it's coming.
Yeah.
You know, there's some kind of like, you know, like the comedy of being an experienced person watching an inexperienced
Sure.
person work their way through it.
Just watching our students flirt with each other
Something
is funny because
Yeah.
I see what you guys are doing.
Right, there's
you know?
something, you know, like who'd have thunk it,
Right,
you know,
right.
about this last line.
Yeah.
You know what it also sounds like to me a little bit is in Confederacy of Dunces,
Yeah.
The vow. It's
Right.
a little bit like you know, like now look what you've done to
Yes,
my vow.
yes,
You know?
yes.
so
Yeah.
I think I feel like, and as you say, we can't pretend like he didn't warn us.
Yeah.
But I feel like Mon has finally sort of like gotten some traction.
Yeah.
I feel like we're onto something that I care about.
Yeah.
That I feel like he cares about.
Yeah. More importantly, it's
and-
like, yeah.
And so I'm kind of looking forward to the next tidbit.
Okay.
I think we've been doing about 50 pages ago, and I haven't even looked. If I'm being 100% honest, I kind of like